Hope everybody's doing well and staying cool in this weather. Thanks for joining us tonight. Our speaker tonight, Patrick Anderson, who'll be joining us, is the lead arborologist with Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements. Many of you know him. He provides direction for Rainbow's regional technical arboricultural advisors and has years of experience with practical tree care experience and conducts field research trials throughout the U.S. with emphasis on plant growth regulators and landscape scale management. Tonight, we're going to be learning about direct injection of products into trees that has been performed for centuries for various reasons. Patrick's going to dig deep in with us on that. Wanted to go around a couple of ground rules for tonight. I will be keeping an active eye on the Q&A. There's two places we can chat. You can see a lot of chatter already happening in the chat. Keep the chatter between ourselves there, but as far as any questions that you want answered by Patrick, please make sure to drop it in the Q&A section because that's where I'll be actively looking, and I think Patrick's going to have an eye on that as well. Towards the end of our session, of course, several of you, are going to want to sign up for your CEUs. So towards the end of the session, twice, towards the end, and then right at the end, I will go ahead and drop the CEU sign-in sheet there in the chat. If you miss it, you can email me, but I'll drop it twice for you. So it's going to take you through a really quick survey about the session and then allow you to submit your CEUs. And then of course, just allow 4 to 6 weeks for ISA to get those posted. So welcome everybody. It looks like pretty much everybody is in. Anybody who logs in late, we are recording this and it will be edited this week, sent out to you guys by Friday, end of the day. All right, well, I am gonna hand it on over to Patrick.
All right, hey, thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and I'm gonna share my screen and we can jump right into it. That works.
Awesome.
Great. Well, hey, thanks for having me here this evening. Always a pleasure to work with the Georgia Arborist Association and look forward to seeing everybody in person, hopefully one day again soon. So this evening, we're going to talk about tree injection. We're specifically wanting to dive more into micro tree injection, but I think it's hard to talk about tree injection at all without kind of just diving into the general tree injection best management practices. So while we'll emphasize micro injection, we're just going to kind of cover tree injection as a whole. And again, cover from the standpoint of really just using the tree injection best management practice guide as our model for this evening. So that's what we're going to do here. And again, as mentioned, if you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A and we'll make sure that we get to them as we go along this evening. So what we're going to come out of here today is we're just going to do a quick introduction of what BMPs are. We're going to talk about a brief history of tree injection, just some fun facts, and then we're going to dive into the tree injection BMP. So we're going to go through it chapter by chapter, and in those chapters, we're going to tie it back into practical solutions using micro tree injection, and then we'll take any questions at the end. So of course, we know the best management practices in arboriculture are published through the International Society of Arboriculture, and they cover a very wide range of topics. And they are authored by industry experts on those topics, along with a host of reviewers that then review the manuscript, make any edits that need to be done. And then that's when we actually get a BMP produced. Right now, there are currently 17 of these best management practices, and several now are actually even written in Spanish. So that's great for our multilingual workforce. What these BMPs do is they take the ANSI A300 standard, which the standards are designed for writing specifications, and they interpret it. So if the ANSI A300 writes a standard procedure, you can go to the BMPs to interpret it, to actually kind of know how to use it in our practical operations. And so the tree injection BMP, this came about, really, there's not really a ANSI standard that is specific to tree injection. There are ANSI standards that cover things that we would do with tree injection, specifically like the integrated pest management standard, as well as even there's a standard that deals with fertilization, and we cover injection of fertilizers really briefly in that one. But there is no like one standard for tree injection. But there was a great kind of outcry from the industry around, what are the best management practices in tree injection? As we'll see, tree injection has been around for millennia, but it wasn't really until recently that there was a consensus around, when to do tree injection, how to do tree injection, and that's what we'll dig into here this evening, of course. But this Tree injection dust management practice is interesting to me because of two of the authors. One, Dr. Tom Smiley, I worked under when I was at the Bartlett Research Labs many years ago. And then the other one, Sean Burnick, is my current boss here at Rainbow Ecoscience. So I'm very much acquainted with both of these authors. So it's really neat to be kind of discussing something like this, knowing these guys so well. But with the tree injection BMP, again, this was reviewed by 18 industry experts, including, other researchers in the industry, manufacturers, and commercial tree care professionals such as yourselves, to make sure that everything is aligned upon and there's a really good consensus on what is covered in the book and how to use it and how to apply injections to trees. It took about 3 years to get together, and the newest edition just came out. I think it was last month or 2 months ago now, the second edition. So if you have the first edition, there's a new edition for you to go out and get. And if you don't have it at all, it's great. It's a great time to pick it up. You can pick it up from the ISA bookstore. Not that I am endorsing that whatsoever, right? But what's interesting too is, I have a story that tree injection really became popular nationwide with the introduction of some of these invasive pests, specifically emerald ash borer. Tree injection had been used in arboriculture for years, and really with the kind of spreading of emerald ash borer, that's when we really started talking more and more about tree injection. But again, tree injection as a tool in plant management can be traced back to its early instance in the 10th century, 12th century rather, with Ottoman sultans injecting substances into the plants to change the color of the leaves or the scents that they produce, which is interesting. Way back in the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci was injecting arsenic into his apple trees to try to ward off thieves eating his apples and trying to poison his apples. And then we look at some of these other early botanists like Hales doing experiments into camphor trees, and again, trying to just change the notes and the aromas in the tree. Then we get catched up here into the 20th century, and then we start getting some of the first round of invasive, in this case, diseases in the United States. The first one being that we really dealt with is chestnut blight. And of course, chestnut blight is still an endemic issue in the United States. We still don't have a way to really manage it. But again, going back to the early introduction, scientists, researchers were trying to inject things into trees to try to prevent this devastating canker disease from killing chestnuts. As we know, and as just mentioned, it didn't really work, right? Which is a bummer. But then you go back into the 60s, and we have some more of these pests that are being introduced. Hemlock Woolley Adelgic is introduced into the East Coast in the 50s. And so the first pre-filled capsule injections are created by Moget, and they're still around today. And these capsules are still around today. But again, this technology, from the standpoint of the industry and using it, has been around for a long time. Again, nothing really new to this tree injection stuff. And then we get kind of our second round of invasive pests with Dutch elm disease kind of coming in. And that's where a lot of work was done at this point now to try to find ways to manage Dutch elm disease. And then a quick plug, the company that I work for got started in the 70s trying to preventatively inject trees for Dutch elm disease. That's how Rainbow Ecoscience, who I work for now, that's how we got started way back in the 70s in Minnesota. Kind of fast forward again here, we get to the 1980s and we get Dr. Alex Shigo, and we start really understanding how trees work, right? And we understand that, this concept of the compartmentalization of decay in trees. And we start understanding really how trees start to function. And really what goes on here is that, you could make an assertion that there was a lot of researchers, a lot of scientists that really understood how trees work, but it was never really, taking to the industry. And that's what made Dr. Shigo so special, is that he really took that to the practitioners and really made it so that those of us in industry could understand how trees work and how we could operate on trees to do it, safely for ourselves in the tree. And so that's where things really start taking off as an industry-wide understanding of how trees really work. And then we get into the 90s and we have technologies that work for Dutch elm disease. We have trunk injection technologies that work for things like oak wilt, and we start doing micro injections of nutrients directly into trees. And then that kind of catches up now into this millennia that we're living in, where we have things like, this emerald ash borer that starts taking the country by storm and killing trees very, very quickly and seemingly indiscriminately. And so now all of a sudden, we understand how to inject trees. We have products that work well to affect these pests, and tree injection takes off. And you see tree injection becoming more and more widely adopted in operations throughout really, the earlier part of this millennia into now, the 2020s. And so that kind of goes back to this first edition of the tree injection guide was published back in 2016. Ash borer, is identified in 2002. It widely spreads. We find that technologies and tree injection and products are a great way to manage that. And so, again, we fast forward 12 years, and then we actually have an aligned upon document on how we want to take care of trees during tree injection. And so the book has 6 chapters plus an appendix, and is, again, as you can imagine, an overview on the topic. It provides situations for use, recommended practices, gets into RFP language, things like that. So what we're going to do, taking it from here, is we're just going to kind of go through every chapter of the book, but then tie it to, the whys and the practical ways to use this in your operations to care for trees. So chapter 1 begins with why use tree injection, right? And really that's like the question we should be asking ourselves with any activity when we manage trees, right? What is the objective of even doing this? Why are we even doing, this practice that we're about to do? And with tree injection, it makes a lot of sense because we know there's other ways to apply products to trees, right? A lot of us have sprayed trees for decades. Things like imidacloprid became popular again in the 90s, knowing that we could do soil applications of trees. There's a lot of ways to apply trees. So why do we want to do tree injection to begin with? We always want to weigh the pros of the cons. We want to weigh the unintended consequences of doing an injection versus not doing an injection. And we just want to take all these things into consideration. And that's where I always like to, anytime we talk about managing pests specifically in the landscape, I always want to bring us back to this idea of the appropriate response process, which again, this was published in the Journal of Arboriculture and Urban Forestry back in 1999 by Dr. John Ball. And to summarize this paper, what we want to do here is we want to start with setting our action thresholds. And so that can mean, at what point is the pest going to kill, manage, maim, damage the tree to the point that it's no longer acceptable to our client. And then what we want to do is we want to go through this constant process of monitoring, going through a diagnostic process to understand what is actually going on with that plant, doing everything we can to prevent this. And then when all of that kind of goes through a cycle, choosing an option for control. And in this case here this evening, we're talking about control being our tree injection option, right? So then this takes us to this next part of, why choose tree injection when we have these other ways of applying products, right? So we have what we call this tree or this plant healthcare toolbox. And in our plant healthcare toolbox, we have things like foliar sprays, right? We have things that we can do as a lower systemic bark spray to affect pests. So fast, easy, low impact on the environment, fast to do. We have soil applications, then we have tree injection. So when we decide upon a method, we have to kind of, look at that appropriate response process and then take it into this other little bucket. And so in this bucket, we have to consider what are our client expectations to begin with. One thing I think we forget a lot in our industry is we have to understand what the client wants out of a service, right? So we have to take and consider the client expectations. Those expectations can be around the plant itself. They could be around the method or how or the when you're going to make applications as well. So that's really important to think of. And then when we go to decide on a method, we have to think of what is the pest? So what is the pest we're actually trying to take control of? And then what's the best way to manage that pest? What is the plant? Is it a very large tree going into the site? Is it a very large tree over water in a sensitive area? We need to take into consideration the pest, the plant, and the site. That then will dictate what our product use is going to be, and in this case, what our product application is going to be. So again, this evening, we're going to talk about why would we do trunk injection. So there's a lot of good reasons to do trunk injection. One is from the standpoint of when we put the product directly into the tree, we know where it's going, right? So let's use the example of, emerald ash borer, I guess, because it's a one we can probably all relate to at some point or another. So with something that's feeding on the interior vascular system of the tree, if we put that product directly into that vascular system, we know exactly where it's going, right? It can't go anywhere else. It can only go up into the plant. So by doing tree injection, we know exactly where that product is going to go. The nice thing about this too is that vascular system is going to protect that product from outside influences. So things like the sun, believe it or not, can break down some of these active ingredients. A good example would be, soil applications of imidacloprid. If you're dealing with a soil that's not percolating very well and it's sitting there on top of that soil, it can actually break down if it's in high sunlight. So by injecting directly into the tree, we're protecting that product. It's going right into the plant. It's protected inside the vascular system of the tree. Another interesting thing to think about is that when some of these products mix with that solution inside the vascular system, they mix with other products, right? So they create these secondary metabolites that actually can be more deadly to the pest than if they were applied directly to that pest. So an example of something like a foliar application of something like acephate, while it's very toxic to a lot of pests, when it mixes with water inside the vascular system, those metabolites actually become more deadly to those pests. So you might see better efficacy with a trunk injection of something like acephate versus a foliar application of something like acephate, which is super interesting. And then finally, we're doing a soil application or a bark spray or even a foliar spray. There's other things out there, right? There are microbes out there. There are microflora, microfauna that can either intercept or break down that active ingredient before it gets that full dose gets to make it into the plant. And when you look at, rates, that's part of the reason why if you look at the rate of like a trunk injection of imidacloprid, we might be doing 2 mils per inch diameter of that direct product into the tree, where, we're looking at something like, maybe, a 0.2 of an ounce or something like that when we're doing a soil application. So we're using a lot less product in these trunk injected applications. And again, part of it is it's going right into the tree. It's not getting held up in the soil mixture. It's not getting degraded by some other microbe. And also it's not getting intercepted by any other root that might be there, right? It can only go one place into that tree. The other reason to use trunk injection, again, is from an efficacy standpoint. So this is work done in avocados, which we're not going to be injecting very many avocados in Georgia, but it paints a picture here. And so what they see is that residues of imidacloprid and dinotefuran, when they're injected into the trees, show up at rates that are 10-fold higher than when done with a soil application. So when we do trunk injection, we're getting higher concentrations of that product into the leaves, which of course turns into efficacy, right? And then the other part of that is it happens a lot faster. So as an example, something like imidacloprid as a soil application, we're comfortable in saying that sometime between 30 and 120 days after that application, you have concentration in those leaves that are high enough to start affecting your pest. Well, with a trunk injection of imidacloprid, you're going to get that effect within a week or two. So you're going to get the product up into the plant a lot faster, and you're going to get in higher concentrations in the leaves to affect those pests. So again, you look at this practically speaking, an issue that we deal with a lot in, Georgia would be something like Lacanium scale. So like a Lacanium scale, especially affecting some of these larger oak trees, is going to be up there feeding on that leaf. And a lot of times we'll get that phone call after it's already raining down honeydew, right? Well, if I want to do a soil application, I have to wait at least a month before that honeydew starts raining down. I could do a trunk injection that day, and within a few days to a week, we would have that honeydew would start to cease because we would start seeing efficacy on the pest. So, again, these in-season treatments of, whether it be an aesthetic pest like Lacanium scale or more of a plant damaging pest like a boring insect, we can affect that pest a lot faster with those trunk injections. That's a great tool in the toolbox for us. The other reason of why to use these, of course, would be around, sensitive sites or people that are sensitive to products, right? In this case here, we got a lot going on in this picture. We have a hemlock that is interplanted with other trees and shrub species that are going to flower. We have a pond, and then on the backside of that, which is crazy, we have like a street. So we have all kinds of things here that we wouldn't necessarily want to have come in contact with something like a foliar spray, or even, with the soil application of some of our products, they can get intercepted and brought up into the flowers of some of these other flowering plants underneath there. So in the case here, a trunk injection is going to be a great opportunity because we can affect the pest feeding that tree. We don't have to worry about any of the unintended consequences of it getting intercepted by other plants that could take it up and translocate those products into their flowers. And then likewise, again, we have pond, all kinds of things we just don't really want to have to affect if we don't have to. So it'd be a great opportunity to use something like a trunk injection in this case here. And then again, just from the perception standpoint, we're not spraying, we're not drenching, we're just putting that product directly into the tree. So nice closed system. And then again, practically speaking, for those of you that do plant healthcare, we know we run into issues, right, with scheduling. Sometimes it's drizzling when we go to spray. Sometimes it's really windy when we go to spray. Sometimes the landscape maintenance company shows up and starts mowing just after we've pulled our hose out to spray a tree, right? So by doing trunk injections, we can eliminate a lot of these things. So again, The weather, while it's still a factor, is going to be less of a factor because we can do trunk injections, especially micro injections. We can be doing these in like, a light rain drizzle. Wind will actually help with uptake. So if we have a windy day, again, we're not going to have to stop spraying applications. We can go right out and do those applications. And then the other part too is just accessibility. If you're driving around in a big spray truck, I've been in some of the neighborhoods that a lot of you guys work in and around Atlanta, and especially over on the west side, when you start getting a little more hilly, driving up some of those driveways is a challenge in some of these big trucks. Again, you can put this in the back of your, Blight pickup, cruise around, do an entire day's worth of work, with just a tiny little handheld thing. So there's a lot of reasons too, just operationally from an efficiency standpoint, why trunk injections make a lot of sense for us. And then what I even failed to neglect, right, is you're going to have a low applicator exposure because you're really just going to be mixing into that bottle versus having to mix everything, spray, come in contact with it. So a lot of these things are going to be more of a closed system. So from an applicator standpoint, it's going to be less exposure to some of these products as well. So now segueing into our next chapter. So that's why to do tree injection. A lot of good reasons why we would think about doing tree injection. Now the types of tree injection. This will get into the nuance of what micro injection is, but we have to talk about what micro and macro injection is to kind of build, what is the difference, right? So we have two types of tree injection, generally speaking. We have what's called macro injection and what's called micro injection. Of course, this evening's topic is really more micro injection, but just to distinguish between the two, macro injection is when we're using larger volumes of water. So this would be like liters to gallons of water to dilute the solution and put it into the vascular system of the tree. This is an example of some of the equipment you could use. You could use something like a hand pump, 3-gallon hand pump for smaller trees, or for products that don't require as much product, kind of like that liter to quart size amount per inch. And then you can do things that take like 50-gallon trash cans, depending upon the product. Now, the question, of course, is why on earth did anybody do macro injection? Because we're going to see micro injections a lot easier to set up. You're using, milliliters to ounces of product. Why the heck would anybody do macro injection when we have micro injection technologies? Well, it comes down to the product choice. So, and this is more for parts of the country that deal with our vascular wilt, specifically oak wilt and Dutch elm disease. But with things like sycamore and anthracnose that will cause a canker and witch's brooming and eventual dieback of the tree, you would also want to do macro injections, or you may do macro injections to try to stop those cankers from forming. And so all these are diseases that are caused by fungi. And so our fungicides have what they call a high coefficient of absorption, or a high KOC. And so just to kind of read the slide here for a second. Adsorption is the adhesion of atoms, ions, or molecules from a gas, liquid, or dissolved solid to a surface. This process creates a film on the absorbate on the surface of the absorbent. So our fungicides have a high KOC value, which means they are much more likely to form a film on the inside of the tree. So if we do an injection of a fungicide and we use either concentrated or low dilutions, there's a high likelihood that's going to form a film on the inside of the tree and not distribute up into the canopy where we need to affect our pathogens. And this is kind of what this is showing here, is that, if you have a high KOC, it's just going to simply get stuck to the inside of your solid surface and not move. So that's when we talk about fungicides, we talk about macro injection. So with the majority of our fungicides, we are going to have to use macro injection to make sure that we get enough dilution to move it up into the top of the tree. We also see this with our micronutrients, where if we don't mix those with enough volume of water, we get uneven distribution in the canopy of the tree. So this doesn't happen every time. If you have maybe a tree on the smaller side, you have a tree that has a really healthy vascular system, it just rained, you're getting a lot of product uptake, you may not see this. But if you have some more factors that kind of move into that area, higher likelihood that you're not going to get uneven distribution, or you are going to get uneven distribution. And so that's why we recommend doing, macro injection of nutrients. Now, this is all counter to micro injection. So we'll focus more here on micro injection. That's the whys of, this is why we're not recommending any of those treatments in micro injection, for those reasons, mainly, again, that high coefficient of absorption. Micro injection By the name, as you can tell, we are using less volume, right? We're either using the concentrate or we are using just low dilution rates with these. And the reason for that is in general, our antibiotics and our insecticides have very low coefficient of absorption. So we're not worried about them getting held up within the vascular system of the plant. Most of our most of our insecticides, what they're racing to accumulate in the leaves. So where we see a lot of our insecticide buildup is going to be more up into the leaves themselves, leaving the vascular system relatively quickly, of course. Now, microinjection, with macroinjection, we kind of had like two choices, right? We had like a can and then we had like a giant trash can. There's a lot of different devices in microinjection. We have the pre-filled capsules like we spoke of, like Moget and TreeTech produce the capsules. Brandt is another company that produces a capsule-like microinjection system. And these are great. Like I always tell people, if you're only doing like one tree injection a year, this is a perfect thing for you, right? It's no equipment to buy, pretty easy to do. You know, again, if you're doing 1 or 2 trees a year, these things are perfect. Then we get into the more of the equipment type stuff. And so some of the older microinjection equipment are what I call single site manual injection. So this is when you're doing 1 injection site at a time and you're just using your hand to pressurize the system. And again, if you're maybe doing 10 trees a year, that's a great piece of equipment for you. But I can tell you, that'll wear your hand out after a while. Then we get into 2 other pieces of equipment. We have the multi-site pressurized system. So in this case here, what you have is a harness that goes around the tree and you're installing it in different parts of the tree all at once. And then you're pressurizing it, in this case with a bicycle pump, just to get the solution moving into the plant. So that would be a multi-site pressurized system. And then you have a single site alternate pressurized system. And so this would be similar to your single site manual, but instead of using your hand, you're using some other kind of outside power source. It could be compressed air, it could be a CO2, or it could be a battery powered piece of equipment. So these are your different ways of applying these micro injection systems, all equally effective. Just comes down to like your operations, how much you're doing, what kind of product you're using, all those types of things play a role in that. Now let's talk about what we can actually use these on. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, the great thing about this stuff is that all of our insecticides are going to work really well. Not all of our insecticides, but our insecticides that are formulated in systemic for tree injection are going to work great in microinjection systems. So this would include things for, our piercing and sucking insects like aphids, our chewing insects like Japanese beetle, our boring insects like emerald ash borer and some of the others, things like caterpillars, and even spider mites. So if you're dealing with trees in sensitive areas or that are large and you're dealing with these pests, that would be great. We also can use these on our bacterial diseases. So we can use antibiotics to suppress the symptoms of bacterial leaf scorch. So again, just suppress the symptoms. It'll still be there, but it's a way to manage that tree for a longer period of time. And we can also use these to suppress the symptoms of twig blight and fire blight. And again, we can talk about the whens and the hows of all these different things, more nuanced, but we can use microinjection to manage these diseases. Where is more appropriate for our macroinjection, again, are going to be with our vascular wilts. So anytime we're injecting a fungicide, so our vascular wilts, our canker diseases, and our micronutrients. Right now, as it stands today, we don't have any great products that you can put into the trunk of the tree that are going to effectively manage foliar diseases. This comes up a lot. There's some products that are labeled for foliar diseases, and it's kind of one of those things where, just because it's on the label doesn't mean it's the best use of that product. So as far as microinjections concerned, just about all of our arthropods, that's the way to manage them. Some of our bacterial diseases, great thing to use it for. Macroinjection is going to be for our fungicides and our nutrients. And right now with foliar diseases, we just don't have a good option. Again, there's nuances to all this, but that's where we're at right now. Let's get into some case studies. So where does microinjection work on some of the pests that we're dealing with in our landscapes? So orange stripe oakworm, this is one it'd be cool if I could see you raise the hands, but don't worry about raising your hands here. So let's say that some of us are dealing with orange striped oakworm, most an aesthetic pest, right? Coming out any day now, if it's not out already. Here, what we did is we did a trunk injection of emamectin benzoate, and within 2 days, we started seeing the majority of those pests dying. So what we had here is this was an interesting trial. We did this with NC State. We treated the trees and then we pulled the leaves off, put the leaves in petri dishes, put the caterpillars in the petri dishes, and then counted to see who lived. So we started out with 8 live insects, and this was replicated 8 times. So we started out with 8 caterpillars in a petri dish in our treated and 9 in our untreated. And over the course of 2 days, we had 1.8 caterpillars alive on average in our treated, and we had 7.8 caterpillars alive in our untreated. So again, great treatment for things like our caterpillars. This is another trial. This is when we just estimated canopy defoliation. This was with Cankerworm, and this is in Charlotte, North Carolina. And here we have our untreated tree, and you can actually see some cankerworms floating around in the picture. We have our untreated tree, and then we have our treated tree. This was trunk injected with acephate, and so you can see the stark difference in the canopy defoliation here. We had quite a bit of defoliation in our untreated tree, and our treated trees held pretty strong through that trial. Looking at a newer one, so spotted lanternfly, if you've not heard of this, this is an exciting new pest coming, just recently confirmed in North Carolina last week. And so here we're looking at trunk injections of dinotefuran. And so what we're looking here is we're looking at the bark spray of dinotefuran, and we're looking at the trunk injection of dinotefuran. And so you can see here that the trunk injection, going back to what we talked about earlier, moving into the tree faster and being a little more efficacious, does a better job of managing this pest. Now, I feel like I need to explain this graph a little bit. I'm not great at using Excel. I apologize. So what we're looking at here, these peaks and valleys, these valleys represent days that there was no data taken. So that's why you get this weird kind of peak and valley, and that's the way it worked out. But the take home here is that we get great efficacy with trunk injections over a very fast time frame here. Looking at Hemlock Woolley Adelgic, again, if you're in the western part of the state, something you're probably dealing with, we're looking at trunk injections of dinotefuran and trunk injections of imidacloprid versus our untreated control in the number of live adults. So again, you can see here that we just get really good efficacy, specifically here in this case with dinotefuran as a trunk injection. So again, just an example of some of the pests and some data to show that this is very practical and can work across a broad range of insects, whether it be a chewing insect, a piercing and sucking insect. And in this case here, looking at, again, suppression of bacterial leaf scorch. So again, those of you who deal with bacterial leaf scorch, you know it's a terminal disease. The plant is always going to have it. But by using oxytetracycline, we can inhibit the growth of that bacteria and thus reduce symptom development over the course of time. And so this is just an example from a trial. This is in State College, Pennsylvania. That's where I went to school at Penn State. But what we're looking at here is this is the same tree. This is the year that it was not treated. And then this is the year it was treated. And you can see, again, a vast reduction in the symptom development in this tree year over year. And then finally, looking at trunk injections of oxytetracycline for fire blight. And so what this will do is this will prevent that canker from forming, and it will prevent that witch's brooming in trees. And so what we have here is a trial. This is year over year. Our axis here is talking about shoot blight severity. And then this is time. The diamonds are the water injected trees. So these trees were just injected with water. And you can see the severity of shoot blight versus the ones that are injected with oxytetracycline, OTC. And again, we can see reduced shoot blight severity in these two trials year over year. So again, we need to turn to that kind of decision tree, right? Is this, what is the client's expectations? What's the site? What's the pest? What's the tree look like? In some of these cases, I might choose a different application method. For example, with fire blight, I would probably still prefer to do foliar applications for that to manage that disease. But if I'm in a site where my client doesn't want me to spray, if I'm in a site, again, where I'm around sensitive species, sensitive plants next to a pond, I don't want to spray, right? I now have another kind of tool in my toolbox that we see can manage that disease to at least to some extent, better than the untreated extent. So always remember, again, I can't emphasize this enough, when we need to go through this like diagnostic process, the appropriate response process, and then that kind of like decision tree of what's the plant, what's the pest, what's my client's expectations, what else is on site to kind of choose our method there. And just kind of like a high kind of hitting the wave tops here on some of the example of the products that we could use through microinjection and some of the things that they would treat. So we have things like dinotefuran and imidacloprid that will treat a whole host of our issues, specifically our piercing and sucking insects and our boring insects and some of our chewing insects. Then we have things like abamectin, that work extremely well on spider mites and eriophyte mites. So again, if you're dealing with Balcyphorus rust mite on a site, you can't spray, client wants you to do something, trunk injection adnectin would be a great choice for you there. Then we have emmectin benzoate, probably most commonly used and known for emerald ash borer, but of course can affect a whole other host of borer, other flat-headed borers, and other clear wing borers. So that's another nice one there. If you're dealing with things like peachtree borer, if you're dealing with Zimmerman pine moth, this is a great product choice for you here, as well as it works on leaf-feeding caterpillars, as we've seen, as well as other leaf-feeding beetles like Japanese beetle. We have things like acephate, which again work on a whole host of piercing and sucking insects, as well as spider mites. Oxytetracycline that we covered over on, which will work on our bacterial diseases and our phytoplasm. So if you're getting down into Florida, I recognize one or two people there that hang out in Florida. Oxytetracycline, which would be used for like your yellowing diseases, lethal bronzing, lethal yellowing. And then you have azadirachtin, which is a derivative of the neem tree. It's often registered as an OMRI product. It works actually as an insect growth regulator, and it can be used on a host of our piercing and sucking insects, as well as caterpillars and some of our flathead borers as well. So just an example of some of the products that you could be using in tree injection. Now just getting into some of more of the nuance here, and some of the, Brittany, if you would just give me a time check every now and then, just to make sure I don't go too far over our time. Appreciate it.
Sorry,
So
I was on mute. Yes, definitely. We've still got a good half hour.
Okay, good. So we'll finish up in plenty of time then. So that's good. So getting then into chapter 3. So that was chapter 1 and chapter 2. So it gets a little bit easier from here on out. Potential damage, things to think about. These are things that always kind of come up, right? So it seems counterintuitive. We're going to wound the tree to help it, right? Well, we do that with pruning all the time, of course. But yeah, this is something that definitely people struggle with is, well, we're going to cause damage to this plant. And certainly we can. But when we see damage with the plant, it almost always comes down to a misapplication with the equipment. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing as we get into an application method, we're seeing, in this case here, we're injecting in the wrong spot on the plant. We want to be injecting down on that root flare. So we get funky reactions. Here we see, in this case, this uses a plug-like called a wedge check to install in the tree and then inject the product through that check. And again, incorrect installation and too much pressure, you actually delaminate the bark. So you will cause physical damage if you don't use the tree correctly, or excuse me, you don't use your equipment correctly. Likewise, this is another thing we see. So what we're looking at here is this is the tree here with the bark pulled off, and this is the section of the bark that got pulled off. And again, what we see in this case is when we use equipment that's not installed correctly, or apparatus that aren't installed correctly, we can see a delamentation of the bark. And that's what you're seeing here is you're seeing when that injection was made, it pushed the bark off. The tree responded to it like it had been wounded. So you're seeing this kind of reaction would here. And then this white stuff, again, because it was a misapplied piece of equipment, this white stuff is actually metacloprid. So not only did we damage the tree in this case, we also didn't deliver our dose that got stuck in that little area. So proper training is super important when we're using tree injection equipment. Again, we can talk more about that later on as well. Other things that we see is we can see in some cases, in rare cases, we see phytotoxicity. This is most often we see phytotoxicity with our fungicides. So again, it comes back to that whole, high coefficient of absorption. If we don't mix it with enough water, it can accumulate in those lower leaves. And this is what we usually see is if it accumulates in those lower leaves, we see this kind of phytotoxic response, mostly with our fungicides. On rare occasions, and I've seen this mostly with emmectin benzoate, as well as my colleagues and maybe even some of you, on rare occasions with emmectin benzoate, you inject that into an ash tree, and within a week, that ash just drops every single leaf. And they always leaf back out, and they always come back, and they always seem healthy, but it's just it's like a less than 10%, I think we've identified, of ash trees will do that. Just a weird little genetic thing on an individual basis. Going back to, some other potential damage here, what we want to try to avoid is annual injections because we want to give that tree a chance to seal over those wounds. But this is what always comes up here is if we inject a tree, aren't we introducing decay? And won't that decay eventually coalesce and potentially become a risk? Which is a great question, right? And so this fellow by the name of Nick Brazzi up in University of Massachusetts undertook a study. And so what he did is he looked at specifically elm trees. So the Dutch elm disease protocol calls for preventative injections every 2 to 3 seasons. So this is injecting these trees every 2 to 3 seasons. Some of the trees in his study, and this was a study looking at mature trees that have been injected for a long period of time. Some of the trees in the study were trees that Rainbow Tree Care up in Minnesota had been taking care of, since, again, like the late to mid 90s. So we had trees in this trial that were on a rotation for almost 30 years. And this is what he found. So if we look here, if I have this highlighted, I don't. If we look here, what this is looking at is we're looking at instances of decay versus no decay. And then we're looking at the history of injection, injected versus not injected. So trees with decay injected 28 out of 91 trees. Trees with decay not injected, 35 of 119 trees. Trees with no decay, 63 on our injected trees. Trees with no decay, 84 on our non-injected trees. So what all this is telling us is that there is no real statistical difference in decay between a treated and an untreated tree. And if just trend-wise, you're getting more decay in your untreated trees, if that makes any sense to anybody out there. So looking at trees that have been injected on a 2 to 3 year rotation, 2 to 3 season rotation, some cases for up to 30 years, we don't see an increase in decay. Some of the reasons for that is, believe it or not, especially if you're drilling a hole that's, say 15, 60 force in diameter, that doesn't seem too big to us, but to a fungus, going back to the disease triangle where you need conducive environment, right? To a fungus, there's a lot of air getting in there, and that site will dry out relatively fast. And of course, the plant is actively trying to work at, sealing off that area, right? So how are they checking for decay in these trees? Oh, are you on mute, Brittany? Or can I just not hear you? That's okay. That's fine.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yeah. So
pods that aren't even in here just connected for some reason.
I love when that
JW has a question I wanted to point out. He said, how are they checking for decay on the elm tree?
That's a great question. And so I don't honestly, this is embarrassing. I honestly don't remember the method on this. I can't remember if they were using a resistograph or if they were using sonic tomography, but I will read this paper this evening and I will email it to Brittany and she can get you that answer. That's
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, there's been a few different ways. So right here, non-destructive detection of internal decay. This tells me that they were using sonic tomography, but let me double check that for you because I don't want to speak wrong and I can't remember because we've looked at this as well and we used several different methods. So, okay, cool, excellent. So yeah, you can cause damage to trees, right? But we know when done correctly to manufacturers' specs, we are not causing that much damage to trees over the long term, which is great news, of course. All right, so chapter 4 gets into application considerations. So timing's going to have to be synced up, one, to the phenology of the plant, and then also the life cycle of the pest, right? So just like with any other treatment, if you treat with a product at the wrong time of that pest life cycle, you're not going to get results, right? You also want to follow your product label. This is a good example. We look at something again like Lacanium scale. So Lacanium scale is going to overwinter on the branches as these instars. Sometime in spring, they're going to wake up in the spring. They're going to start to feed. They're going to molt into adults. Those adults are going to lay eggs. And then the crawlers are going to climb out onto the leaves. And so I mentioned this a little earlier on. A lot of these insecticides, they want to accumulate into that leaf tissue. So if I want to manage Lacanium scale, what I want to do is I want to target my applications to get these crawlers that are hanging out there on the leaves. So same thing goes. If I come in, if I'm doing a soil application, I could do that, sometime way back here in the spring and be happy. But if I'm coming in, late May, June, or July to get that call that my, car is getting covered by honeydew, tree injection right now at this time is going to be a great opportunity for you right there. So that's when we want to look at tree injection. And again, example of timing. If I used a product, let's say acephate, a product that doesn't have a very long residual, If I shot that up into the tree in this kind of stage, in between like the adults and the eggs hatching, I might not get really good results. And this just kind of takes that example home, right? If there's an example of using imidacloprid, if I spray imidacloprid, I'm going to get results within hours of treatment, but I'm only going to have a 14-day residual. And this is true of a lot of our foliar applications. If I do a soil application, I might have to wait 30 to 60 days, maybe 120 days in some of our really big trees down here. But I'm going to get the rest of the season long control. With the tree injection, though, I'm going to get that product up into the tree within days, and I'm still going to maintain that season long control. So again, these are just reasons why you would show up to a plant and decide to do a tree injection over other methods. The other application considerations we need to take in account of are things like the environment. So again, soil volume, soil moisture, relative humidity. We're relying upon transpiration, just like with any of our systemic products. We're relying upon transpiration to carry the product up through the plant. So if we have low amounts of soil volume, not a lot of roots, dry soils, that's going to delay our uptake. It's going to delay our uptake. It's going to delay our distribution. It's going to mean we're also spending more time on site because all that's going to take time to do. Relative humidity as well. Again, transpiration works by, evaporation of water vapor from leaves. So if we have a high concentration of water in the form of atmospheric humidity, we're just going to get less pull from those leaves, which again is going to dictate to not as fast uptake, not as fast distribution, and again, just more time out on site. And the other part of this is the time of day. So, we see that once you get into the afternoon hours, those stomates tend to close, especially on hot days, those stomates will close, which of course, again, we're relied upon transpiration to pull this product up. So if the stomates are closed, we're not getting transpiration, again, delayed uptake, timing, what have you, more time on site. So these are things to consider when you're going out to actually make applications or when to schedule your applications. Tree phenology, obviously this makes sense, right? We see our best uptake when trees are actively growing. So right around half leaf out to full leaf out is when we want to target a lot of these applications to make sure, again, we're getting good uptake and distribution. And then likewise, stressed trees or damaged trees. If you have a significant portion of the vascular system damaged, maybe it was hit by a car, tractor, what have you. We've seen this too with roots where we have, a significant portion of the surface roots have been run over by like a lawnmower or something. These things, they detract from the uptake of the solution. And you might see gaps in your protection. And of course, it's going to take more time out on site. So these are things to also consider. If you're showing up, you walk up to a tree and it's just, the base has been devastated for whatever reason, you might not get a good uptake in distribution. Not that soil applications are going to work any much better in that case, potentially, but these are things, again, to consider expectations for your client. And then the next thing to talk about is how do we actually put these things into the tree? And this is probably where a lot of the nuts and the bolts come into this. Going back just a few chapters earlier, we looked at some of the damage, and I mentioned they injected high up on the trunk, and that's part of the reason why we see that issue there. Well, we have found, again, this is years, a lot of it anecdotal, of course, but we get best uptake and distribution by going as low on the root flare as practical. So with macro injection, we would want to do a full-on root collar excavation. We want to pull back as much of that root flare as possible. With micro injection, it's a lot more forgiving, but we still want to concentrate our trunk injections as low on the root flare as possible. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is simply the sapwood, the xylem tissue in this area, the active xylem tissue in this area, it's just a lot wider. So we just have more xylem, active xylem to affect the lower down on the tree we go. Versus, as you can see in this representation, as we get higher up in the tree, that vascular system becomes narrow. And so we have a higher likelihood of not hitting that vascular system if we get too deep, especially. So getting down on the root flare is the preferred area. For reason one, we have a wider area vascular system. Reason two is we are injecting product into the vessels of that vascular system. So remember, the vessels are kind of like the series of straws that go up into the canopy of the tree. Just kind of a descriptive word there, of course, straw that is. And so in that area, those vessels are wider. So as we get up into the tree, those vessels are smaller. As we're down in that vascular system, those vessels are wider. So again, from an uptake standpoint, we have more area to put product in. So it helps us to go faster. And then just from a distribution standpoint, because they're bigger in that area, we also get better radial distribution in the tree when we get further down there. So We get faster uptake, better distribution, both up into the tree and then radially when we get down into the root flare. And then finally, what some data has shown is that root flare will heal about 1.5 times faster. And again, these are generalities, but 1.5 times faster than up on the trunk. So what that means is, again, that wound that we treat is going to seal over. And I mentioned heal, I apologize, seal over faster down on the root flare versus higher up on the trunk. So again, just from that aspect. So when we talk about the actual application, again, we want even distribution of our injection ports. So even distribution around the base of the tree, but with concentrations on the root flare. So there's still some recommendations I see on some of these labels that talk about pacing your injection sites like 6 inches apart, which is like a good metric to go for. But what we want is we want even distribution on the root flares while avoiding these kind of valleys or sinuses. So in this case here, you can see we have a pretty good gap between these root flares, but I would much rather have 2 injection sites on a big root flare than put an injection site into this kind of peak and valley. Again, we know that we're getting our best uptake and distribution on these root flares. So concentrating on the root flares is going to give us that good uptake and distribution. Whereas in this area here, this is more akin to the trunk tissue. So if we were to kind of dissect this tree like this, we would see that in this valley, we're going to have a compressed vascular system. It's going to be more narrow. The vessels are going to be smaller. So there's not a lot of value to injecting into that area. You're just going to get, again, not as good uptake, and it's going to be a little bit slower, right? So even distribution of the product on the root flares, avoiding these peaks and valleys. We'd also want to avoid, if we had girdling roots, we'd want to go above that root, or we want to, of course, sever that root ideally. If we had damage, we want to go above the damage. So again, there's reasons why we might not be able to get on that root flare, but those are some of the things that we want to take into consideration making the application. Now, the other part of this application, so after we've identified that we want to get down on the root flare, the other part of this application, this sounds so silly, and I always feel silly talking about it, but we want to use sharp drill bits. And so again, why do we want to use a sharp drill bit? Well, going back to the architecture of the wood, we're going into the active xylem that is made up of these vessels, right? That are, again, kind of like straws. By using a sharp drill bit, we're clean cutting that area, right? So we're clean cutting right into that vessel, opening it up, allowing us to put product into it. If we use a dull drill bit, we're going to start chewing that up, right? So it's not going to be a clean cut. We're going to pull debris into it. We're going to kind of like, like you're chewing, if you're one of those people that buy a soda and then chew on your straw, right? By the time you get chewing on your straw, it's all flat, it's harder to drink through, right? So we're going to do that to those vessel elements. So we want to use a nice clean drill bit to make sure that we are cutting right into those vessels, nice clean cuts so that we can put our product right up into the plant. And a good way to do this, a little contrast here is not that great, is when you're drilling to the tree, when you pull it out, you want this singular kind of spiraled piece of wood. We call it pigtails or woodworms. When that kind of consistency starts breaking up, when it starts, that wood pigtail starts to break up or it's more dusty, that's a sign that your bit is dulling up and it's time to change your drill bit. The other thing here is we want to make sure that we are going perpendicular to the vascular system. So that's not perpendicular, on 90-degree angle, like on center all the time. You want to go perpendicular to the vascular system. So what we're seeing here in this photo is the gentleman is going perpendicular to that root flare into the vascular system of the tree. Because we want to open up those vessels so that we can put our product right up into that area there. We don't want to spin our bit. We don't want to, again, if we spin our bit, we could cauterize the wound. We don't want to do like the shaky. I've seen all kinds of crazy stuff. You wall out the hole, then you're going to get leaking from RT. Perpendicular, sharp bit, quick in and out, pulling out a nice clean woodworm. The other thing is depth. So specifically with our hardwood trees, we only need to go about 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch past the bark. And because that is where our most active area of xylem is going to be. Our most active xylem is going to be the newest xylem put on. So that's where we want to target. If we go too deep, we could be getting into xylem that's slowly kind of turning over. We could also, if we get too deep, we could just get into non-active xylem. And then, of course, it's not going to go anywhere, right? It's going to sit back in that area. So we only need to go about 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch past the bark on hardwoods. On pine trees, though, because of the difference in the architecture, they don't have vessels. They have tracheas, which are much smaller, and that vascular system is often a lot wider. We're going to go a little bit deeper, maybe 3 inches into the tree. So that's going to be, for pines, we're going to go deeper because of the architecture of the wood, and we'll look at some pictures of this in a little bit. Sam asked, do you apply injections differently for diffuse porous trees versus ring porous trees, sieve cells versus sieve tube cells? And so I can't speak to the sieves, but I can speak to, we would, for no matter the arrangement of the vessels, we're going to still inject the same way in these hardwood trees. But what we will discuss here in a second, we'll share some pictures. For whatever reason, diffuse porous trees generally take up product slower than a ring porous tree would. So again, when we were kind of planning out, again, we see distribution is the same, uptake, or distribution is the same. Well, for whatever reason, that uptake is slow on those diffuse porous trees versus those ring porous trees. And we'll take a look here in a few moments at what that looks like. Oh, and yeah, so just administering injections, right? Follow the label. Also, use products that are formulated for tree injection. Use some examples here this evening. Things like there's formulations of imidacloprid that are intended for soil application, and there's formulations of imidacloprid that are intended for trunk injection. The soil injection formulations of imidacloprid, most of them are going to be in a concentrate. They're going to be in a suspension concentrate. That's not going to go into a tree very well, right? Whereas these formulations that are for tree injection specifically, that are more in this aqueous solution, those are going to be going right into the plant. So make sure, just because it is the same active ingredient doesn't mean you can save money by going and buying it off the shelf, that's labeled for soil application, and put it into the trunk of the tree. You're going to have a bad time. So make sure you're using the correct formulations for trunk injection. We're going to wrap it up here real soon. So chapter 6, we don't spend a lot of time on, just talks about record keeping. A lot of us know that. Then we get into the appendix and glossary. And this kind of goes into what we were just kind of talking about here, and really this is around expectation, one about uptake timing. So for whatever reason, diffuse porous trees, so a maple tree is an example of diffuse porous trees. And if you're not familiar with this terminology, this is what we're looking at here. In between these arrows is growth ring, so 1 year of growth. And in a diffuse porous tree, you can see that the vessels are pretty evenly distributed across that entire growth ring. So you can see this early wood and late wood, and certainly they're kind of more in that early wood than they are in that late wood, but they're more evenly distributed in that ring. Whereas in a ring porous tree, these vessels are more concentrated in that early wood. So this is the first part of that growth ring put on that year, and this is that later wood. And so you can see they're a lot smaller and less of, kind of in that, smaller, really not less of, but smaller in that late wood. And so for whatever reason, I don't have an answer for you. You would think the diffuse porous trees would go faster because you have a lot more vessels across the growth ring, but these ring porous trees inject faster. And to the question, we don't change our technique here. It's just we know that if we're dealing with something like a maples just, they take longer to inject than an oak tree would. Likewise, we have to deal with the difference between conifers and angiosperms. And so again, kind of getting an idea of scale here. So this is a Douglas fir, which is real typical of, what a pine tree would look like if we dissected it. Our conifer species, like our pines that we're dealing with here in Georgia, they don't have vessels. They have tracheads. Tracheads are a little bit different. So all these little dots in here, as you can see, these are tracheads. So there's a lot of them, but they're really small, right? The diameter is exceptionally small compared to one of these vessels. So with a conifer, again, we get slower uptake because we simply just have less area to push this stuff into, right? And then, the other thing we're dealing with here is we have resin ducts in conifers, and that's kind of what the defense is, to produce like a sap or resin, right, to kind of push things out. So when inevitably you dig into one of these resin ducts, you're going to start getting sap or resin pouring out. So that is also kind of battling, because that's going to, of course, fill in your area there, and you're going to have to fight that resin. You can still do it. It just takes a little bit longer time. So with the hardwood, I'm thinking I'm usually out of there in 10 minutes. With a pine, it's probably going to be more like 30 minutes for the same size tree, same formulation. So just things to keep in mind there. And again, just some examples here of some diffuse porous trees versus some ring porous trees. And then finally, the BMP wraps up with just examples of some bid specs that you can use. So if you're not used to bidding plant healthcare or trunk injection, it provides some guidance on that. And then just to wrap things up here, always remember this, we talked a lot about tree injection here, right? Because that's what we were asked to talk about. But just know that tree injection is part of your, plant healthcare toolbox. So you always want to go through that process, right? The appropriate response process. What is the pest I'm actually dealing with? And then, looking at your client's expectations. What is that pest? What is the tree? What is the site? What is the best application method and product? All things considered. And again, to wrap it up, tree injections serve as an important tool in the plant healthcare toolbox. The tree, pest, and site must be considered when choosing your injections, and then developing a diagnostic approach is a key to your success. And so there you go. It's my contact information. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. I'm 5 minutes, right?
Right, you did perfect. Good job. Yeah, looks like we've got some questions coming in. And while those are coming in, I'm going to go ahead and drop that sign-in sheet and evaluation in the chat for you guys. But you carry on with the questions, Patrick.
Perfect. And so this one here, no, I've never done injections with calcium. I don't know if anyone ever has. I don't know anybody that has done injections with calcium, but it'd be interesting because we often have calcium lacking in our soils. And so it would be interesting if, I don't even know if you can direct inject calcium. That's a good question. I'm going to bring that up in our research meeting and maybe we're on to something there. I don't know. It's like there's been 2 questions asked and I don't think I've been any help at either of those questions. So, which seems typical. That's fine.
You got some homework to do, I guess.
Okay, cool. In regards to dinotefuran as an injection, have you seen success with gloomy scale? Yes. Trunk injection of dinotefuran for gloomy scale is very effective on that pest for sure. So be a good application, especially, if you're dealing with things like, one thing we didn't talk about, and I don't know the laws in Georgia, but, a lot of these labels will have pounds per square acre limitations. And so if that becomes an issue, like you've applied X amount of product to that acre so you can't apply anymore, that's where trunk injection also becomes a great tool because there's no pounds per square acre limitations with a trunk injection because it's all going into the tree. So if you're managing like a big, corporate site or homeowners association type place, that might be a tool you can use.
Any other questions? Has everybody gotten the CEU sign-in sheet in the chat? Make sure you do check that. Even after we end, I'll leave it open for a little bit for everybody to grab it. Just know it's going to take you first to an evaluation. Once you submit that evaluation, it will direct you to your CEU sign-in sheet. Any other questions? I know I learned a lot.
Right on. Well, yeah, no, and I'm always happy to take calls, texts, emails. That's my contact information. If anyone has any questions or thinks of anything later on, I'm always happy to hear from you. So,
well, I guess we can end it there. Thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us. It was a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate you.
Appreciate you guys. Thanks so much and have a great evening.